the act of writing is meaningless.
The alphabet has a great past and no future.
It can be very scary sometimes to realize how, as a culture, we are losing the ability to communicate with words.
As the signs of the times herald the demise of the alphabet, and writing seems to have lost its meaning, the loss of written communication as we know it is indeed a scary thought. For writing is the only means of preserving human myths, traditions, and learning over the centuries. Artifacts may be reminiscent of old civilizations, but without writing, man's thoughts are lost. Not without reason, scientists see the creation of writing as the dawn of history. And it is almost as if whatever came before had never happened. History begins here, in Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, rivers that nourished the Garden of Eden. This was the home of the Sumerians. We do not know where they came from and when they settled in the Fertile Crescent. However, their civilization was to have a profound influence on the ancient Near East in the 3rd millennium BC. This civilization brought forth one of the greatest of mankind's achievements, the concept of writing. However, even before the Sumerians, man had left signs of times long past. But the cave paintings created by our Paleolithic ancestors about 25,000 years ago do not readily divulge their secrets. Why Paleolithic man chose to create his works of art in the darkest recesses of caves remains a mystery. Researchers trying to decipher the meaning of those images look for explanations in the realms of myth and religion, the invocation of hunting skills, or man's ancient desire to cheat mortality by leaving traces of his existence. We may never know for sure. So far, researchers have only managed to work out the techniques and materials used to create those prehistoric images. They were made by extracting pigments from minerals and charcoal and mixing them with water or saliva. The images were drawn, painted, or carved. Sometimes the paint was blown directly onto the rock. With the tools and materials at his disposal, Paleolithic man would have been capable of writing if writing had existed. But it was not the earth pigments of the Stone Age that were used to create the earliest form of writing. It was clay from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. At that time, the way to school, to their writing lessons, often took the children to the river. Their first lesson was to use the clay to prepare a proper writing surface.
زين خوش طين جبتوا لنا؟ سلام هلا خلوا هنا. أي عافية تعالوا ها كل من ياخذ العودة مالته ها يلا عافية. هسه اليوم راح نتعلم شلون نكتب على الطين. أحمد ابني قوم جيبوا لنا طين كل واحد من مكان. زين ومن انتوا اثنين شوفوا شلون دا يطلعون الطين هذا من هناك. طين صاحبك اخذها وقوم وانت اخذ لك وحده لخه من هناك همين. اي افتحها عافيه. رجع الوصله لمكانها يا عافيه وقوم. يعني تعال اقعد بمكانك. لا تصير مدوره زين.
However, it was only the children of the privileged who had the opportunity to learn the art of writing. Writing skills were the exclusive domain of a small, well-organized group, the backbone of Sumerian civilization, the priests and the scribes.
نعصرها الشكل نعصرها حتى تصير قرص. حتى تصير قرص زين. يجوها زين حتى تكون متساوية. كل زين. شو أنت مالتك؟
When the tablet was ready, a reed was used for writing. The wedge-shaped marks gave a name to this first form of writing in the history of mankind, cuneiform.
Hey.
The typical palm-sized tablet was used by the Sumerians for writing practice only. These tablets were simply thrown away after use, so many of them have been found. The tablets always bear inscriptions on both sides, because the master would write out new lessons on the front to be copied by the pupil on the back.
ايه وحده تلخ منها تديها فرفر ايدك فر. ايه عافيه. عافيه كل زين. عليه شوف شلون سويت الصندوق. زين.
However, cuneiform, the Sumerian script, was no spontaneous invention. It developed over several centuries from pictograms and images. Each image was a simple representation of a word, a given object. But not only was this system limited in its power of expression, it was also extremely complicated. As soon as a sign evolved into a representation of a sound rather than an object, that same sign could be used for several phonetically similar concepts. The use of more abstract symbols was a significant achievement, marking the development from word-based to sound-based scripts. Increasing abstraction over the centuries reduced the number of signs used by the Sumerians from 2,000 to about 500. At the same time, the signs underwent a process of simplification and stylization, until a symbol had practically nothing in common with its original image. The Sumerians lived in tightly organized city-states. Monumental temples like the Ziggurat of Ur, which is older than the Egyptian pyramids and served as a model for the legendary Tower of Babel, were the city's intellectual, spiritual, and commercial centers. The temple was the most powerful symbol of this urban civilization, the civilization that gave birth to the concept of writing.
هاي الكتابة باسم أورنمو وباسم شولقي وباسم بورسين 7 ملوك بانيها الزقورة هاي لأجل العبادة معبد.
The earliest written documents found were used for accounting purposes. However, the abundance and great variety of Sumerian writing lead us to assume that written documentation was more than just a matter of economic necessity. The Euphrates River has long since changed its course, and the desert has reclaimed the temples. Today, just a handful of guards watch over the remnants of the civilization that developed writing as we know it. But it is not only temples and tablets that recall the beginnings of writing. The profession of the scribe still exists in present-day Iraq, where they serve their clients outside offices and government buildings. Today's marsh Arabs, inhabitants of the wetlands of southern Iraq, bring back to mind the Garden of Eden and life in the Sumerian kingdom.
يعني اليوم لازم نكمل كلام.
اليوم تكملون اليوم. لازم نكمل. اليوم تكمل يوم الطلاقة. كله كامل. مشكو واحد عنده.
They have lived in the same manner for thousands of years, but modern Iraq has no place for them. The wetlands are being systematically drained, dooming the marsh Arabs, the last living reminders of a remarkable civilization, to extinction. The idea of writing traveled along the major trade routes, spreading throughout the Middle East. By 1400 BC, Sumerian cuneiform was widely used in international trade. It was to be many centuries before it disappeared, giving way to the next phase in the development of writing. In the 2nd millennium BC, the Phoenicians developed the first alphabetic script. Instead of pictograms, it consisted of signs that represented individual syllables. The Phoenicians used 22 signs, each of which stood for a sound. However, they did not have signs for vowels. Not only was Phoenician writing the first alphabetic script in history, it was also the most influential. In fact, most modern alphabets have their roots in the Phoenicians' outstanding cultural achievement. The forms of the Phoenician signs seem to have been inspired by the hieroglyphics used by the Egyptians, with whom they had close economic and diplomatic ties. Egyptian hieroglyphics were pictographic, that is, graphic renditions of the actual object, with additional signs added for the sake of clarity. The use of hieroglyphics was governed by a complex set of rules. A strict hierarchy determined the order of the individual signs, giving priority to gods and holy symbols. Because hieroglyphics were used exclusively by the privileged castes of priests and scribes, the use of writing remained conservative and never, in its 3,000 years of history, evolved into a simpler, more stylized alphabetic script. It was this rigid tradition that ultimately led to the decline of hieroglyphics, and all knowledge of them was lost. The Phoenicians were far more open to foreign cultures. By founding trading outposts, they managed to spread their Near Eastern civilization throughout the Mediterranean. In this way, their script reached ancient Greece. The Greeks added vowels to the Phoenician system. To denote those vowels, they used Phoenician signs that did not have phonetic equivalents in the Greek language. Eventually, Aleph, the first letter of the Phoenician alphabet, meaning ox, evolved into a completely different sign that no longer bore any relation to an animal. The Phoenicians emphasized speed, not aesthetics, in their script. When the letter reached ancient Greece, it looked like that. In the hands of the Greeks, it changed until Aleph had become Alpha. And the first two Greek letters gave the alphabet its name. In present-day Tuscany, examples of Etruscan art bear witness to the powerful influence of ancient Greece, which went far beyond mere stylistic imitation. When the Greeks established colonies throughout the Italian peninsula, the Etruscans absorbed the Greek alphabet. Although Etruscan civilization is highly enigmatic, it has been established beyond doubt that the Etruscan city-states passed their script on to ancient Rome, whose ascent in turn sealed the decline of the Etruscan culture. The 24th of August, 79 AD, saw a historical catastrophe that has ironically proven immensely useful to modern archaeologists. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius caught the inhabitants of Pompeii and Herculaneum by surprise, and only a lucky few managed to escape the deadly shower of ash. Their settlements were buried to such a depth that all memory of them faded as the centuries passed. It was not until 1748 that the two Roman cities were rediscovered, and this unique archaeological find, perfectly preserved in lava and ash, enabled archaeologists to reconstruct life in a Roman city down to the minutest detail. Squares and public buildings, private houses and artisans' workshops, the property of the rich and of the poor. At the time of the volcanic eruption, Pompeii had a population of 10,000, two of whom were Terentius and Silvana Neo. They owned one of Pompeii's many bakeries. Being typical representatives of the middle class, it was quite normal for them to know how to read and write. They used wax tablets for most writing purposes. Thereby, two wooden tablets were joined with string so that they opened like a book, and then filled with soft wax. A stylus was used for writing. The stylus was made of wood, metal, or even ivory. A message could easily be erased by smoothing the wax with the blunt end of the stylus. Italic letters were used to make writing on the wax quicker and more efficient. Tablets were simple to use and cheap to make, so for the first time in human history, reading and writing were not the exclusive domain of a small elite. The Roman Empire was the first civilization whose educational system provided reading and writing skills for vast parts of its population. This democratization of writing constitutes Rome's greatest contribution to the history of writing. The political slogans on Pompeian buildings reflect the population's high level of literacy. At the time of the volcanic eruption, an election campaign for the office of mayor was in full swing. The slogans are written in uncial lettering, the second Roman form of writing. Like all other Roman scripts, it consisted only of capital letters. The rounded uncials evolved from the carved capital letters, which represent the third Roman letter type, used mainly for stone inscriptions. They still affirm the empire's authority on the ruins of monumental Roman buildings. Above all, though, writing was an instrument of power in ancient Rome. It was indispensable to the administration of a huge empire. Written messages and orders were carried to the remotest corners of the empire, and the written language also made it possible to implement a complex legal system. Roman capitals, also known as uppercase letters, were aesthetically well defined and remained virtually unchanged for centuries. The endurance of that classical beauty was in sharp contrast to the chaos and disorder of the early Middle Ages. The fall of the West Roman Empire ushered in an era of political upheaval, barbarity, and cultural stagnation in Europe. There was nothing to fill the intellectual vacuum. It was the Christian Church that proved to be the only bond capable of holding people together during the so-called Dark Ages. That unifying force prevailed behind the massive walls of monasteries. Monasteries were solitary strongholds of intellectual life, nurturing the fine arts, science, architecture, agriculture, and the art of writing. Reading and writing skills had been widespread in the Roman Empire, but during the Middle Ages they were confined to a small clerical elite. Almost all the clergy were nobles, and the cultural gap between them and the common people could not have been wider. Monastic life followed strict rules. Doing service to the Lord inferred devotion, obedience, physical labor, and contemplation. The tasks at hand were to preserve, to save, and to spread the word of the Lord. Unlike most other world religions, the Christian faith largely rests upon scriptures and written sources. As it says in the Old Testament, "And the Lord said unto Moses, Write this for a memorial in a book." By copying the Holy Scriptures, monks preserved and thus saved the art of writing for Western civilization. Europe's first standardized script, Carolingian minuscule, evolved around 780 AD, during the reign of Emperor Charlemagne. The letters were simple and well-defined, and for the first time, there were capitals and small letters. Thereby, Carolingian minuscule was the precursor of all modern Western scripts. By the Middle Ages, the Roman wax tablets had been replaced by parchment or vellum, untanned skins of goat, sheep, or calf that were smoothed and cut into the shape of books. Writing was done with quills. Many monasteries had their own parchment workshops. A scriptorium like this, however, was a rarity. Writing was usually done wherever a bright and warm spot could be found, most often in the kitchen. In the monasteries, writing was a form of worship, putting artistic skills and craftsmanship to the highest service of the Lord. Time was of no importance, and writing was far removed from economic considerations. The monks, who had originally adopted the Roman script, in fact wrote in the style of their time. The artistic creation of the letters became increasingly important. Thereby, aesthetic considerations gained precedence over legibility. Out of the Carolingian minuscule emerged Romanesque script, which in turn developed into elongated Gothic lettering, elegant but difficult to read. But whichever script a monk used, it took hours, days, even weeks to finish a single page. That, however, was soon to change. In the middle of the 15th century, a citizen of the German town of Mainz by the name of Johannes Gensfleisch, also called Gutenberg after his place of residence, transformed the world. Taking great pains to keep his project secret, he spent years working on his revolutionary plan to mechanize the production of books. Printing had existed before Gutenberg, but only for the manufacture of playing cards, fabrics, and pamphlets. Up to that time, nobody had ever dared mechanize the production of precious manuscripts. Gutenberg was not primarily interested in improving the form of writing. He wanted to solve the technical problems of the printing process. To do so, he chose the most splendid contemporary manuscripts as models and strove to emulate their artistic standards in every detail. Gutenberg's greatest achievement was the invention of movable type, letters made out of metal. He developed a casting machine that enabled him to produce as many individual letters as necessary. He cut a metal stamp for each letter that could then be inserted into the casting machine. In this way, Gutenberg produced a large assortment of various letters and kept them handy in his type case. Gutenberg's genius is manifest in the fact that his inventions were much more than just an early form of printing. Movable type, the type case, the composing stick, the composing galley, and the reglet were well thought out elements of a fully developed technical system that has remained virtually unchanged through centuries of book printing. Whereas a busy monk might take a year to finish a single handwritten manuscript, Gutenberg produced an impressive 180 books in only a few years. Although even the most diligent monk could not keep up with Gutenberg in terms of speed, the monk was still at an advantage. He was significantly cheaper than Gutenberg's complicated machinery. There was no shortage of time and labor in those days, and Gutenberg's business venture was doomed to failure. The records show that he was bankrupt by 1458. But what Gutenberg had given mankind was an invention with enormous potential, an ingenious attempt to impose order on a world dominated by a Babylonian confusion of tongues. There are more than 5,000 living languages, but all of them are made up of the small inventory of about 40 distinct sounds that man can articulate. What the alphabet does is reduce the various sounds of speech to distinct phones and give a different symbol to each. Strictly speaking, alphabetic script is nothing but visible speech, an imitation of sounds. It was Gutenberg's brilliant idea to mechanize the visualization of speech, and his type case contains its sound inventory. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Jacques Offenbach's Couplet d'Alphabet is a play on the sounds of letters. His aria may have been forgotten, but Gutenberg's music has changed the world. Gutenberg's stroke of genius set into motion the collective knowledge of mankind. It was transferred to the bookshelves, and man became the center of the universe. When Gutenberg invented his printing press, there were only 30,000 books in all of Europe, and most of them were Bibles and Bible interpretations. Just 50 years later, the number had grown to nearly 9 million, and their content was becoming increasingly secular. Contemporary experts did not predict a bright future for book printing because they assumed that hardly anybody would be able to read. Nevertheless, the book became the first mass-produced article in history. It gave birth to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Reason, the Industrial Revolution, and democracy. All of those momentous historical developments would have been impossible without widespread dissemination of the printed word. Reading and writing skills were democratized and compulsory education introduced to guarantee that everybody could acquire these crucial cultural abilities. That hasn't changed. Every day, millions of children around the globe struggle to acquire those basic skills with varying degrees of enthusiasm. It will make little difference to them that they are grappling with the most recent stage in the evolution of writing. They have other problems on their mind.
Beobachte Hummel. Der eine Hummel habe ich vergessen.
Weißt du noch unser Auffassungszeichen? Mach das vor der Hummel hin und schreibst oben drüber das eine.
这个横线上。
Yet children from Western cultures have a far easier time than their Chinese counterparts, who have to understand the complex images that underlie a tradition handed down over thousands of years. Picture-based scripts, like Chinese, are far more complicated because they rely on the principle of one word corresponding to one sign. Picture-based scripts, like Chinese, are far more complicated because they rely on the principle of one word corresponding to one sign. To put it another way, Chinese writing captures the meaning of a word, not its sound. Whereas a mere 26 signs suffice to describe the whole world in Western languages, one has to master thousands of signs to be literate in Chinese. These two groups of children belong to different worlds, in more than just a cultural and historical sense, and the difficulty of the languages they have to master. The graphic signs used by the Chinese language stimulate the right half of the brain, where our emotional, musical, and creative potential is located. Alphabetic scripts, on the other hand, force us to add letter to letter, word to word, sentence to sentence, and line to line, in a linear and logical manner. This stimulates the left side of the brain, the center for logical analytical thinking.
Es ist eines der wesentlichen Merkmale des alphabetischen Schriftsystems.
Alphabetic scripts emphasize the intellect, the rational aspects of human thinking, that part of our brain that deals with reason.
The alphabet shapes our thoughts. The logical analytical character of Western thinking and our rational alphabet are dependent on each other. Media expert Peter Brook has researched the cultural and sociological implications of different writing systems. In his opinion, the fact that alphabetic scripts show a bias towards rational thought implies certain disadvantages.
We are losing not only the associative, emotional side of written communication, but also its aesthetic aspects.
Eric McLuhan is of a similar opinion. The son of eminent media theorist Marshall McLuhan is a distinguished author and publisher. He specializes in the wide-ranging field of media research.
The alphabet is strange in that it is so extreme, and it's left brain bias. It has the power to shut off the right side of the brain almost completely, and to emphasize the left.
That may be why the art of calligraphy, or stylized handwriting, is primarily an Eastern tradition, without a genuine equivalent in Western culture. In Oriental tradition, writing is not just the jotting down of the odd memo, but the creation of a perfectly shaped sign. It's the craftsmanship that counts, not the time it takes.
Im Westen, in Europa, haben wir
In the West, or to be more precise, in Europe, there is a deep-rooted bias against more complex pictorial languages and systems of writing. Because they are less abstract, we believe that they are inferior to our Latin and Greek systems. This prejudice is unjustified.
Es lässt sich nirgendwo nachweisen.
There is no proof that pictorial scripts and complex systems of writing hinder the development of highly complex cultures and civilizations.
Picture-based scripts, complex as they may be, have one big advantage. They can be read and understood by people who speak different languages. In China, for example, there are over 100 distinct languages, but theoretically, everybody can read the same newspaper. The underlying principle is easy to explain. We apply it every day. All those widely known pictograms that help us orientate ourselves beyond the borders of language are simply cosmopolitan relatives of Chinese characters.
59, departure for Frankfurt, gate number A6, flight 5445.
And images are gaining in importance. Half a century after Johannes Gutenberg, the collective knowledge of mankind is about to be transformed again.
With the invention of book printing, human knowledge moved from our brains onto paper. With the invention of computers, human knowledge moved from paper to computer disks. And now, at the onset of the digital age, knowledge is moving from computer disks into networks.
But what will be the consequences of this current movement? Many people are convinced that the sociological effects will be as revolutionary as those of book printing. Nicholas Negroponte is one of the leading proponents of this view. Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he is head of the MIT Media Lab, the world's most renowned think tank for the digital future.
We're very much in the middle, or let me say at the beginning, of a cultural revolution, which is driven by the connection of people.
Andrew Lerner is head of the electronic publishing department at one of the world's largest media companies.
We are on the edge, I believe, of a revolution unlike anything the world has really ever seen before. I realize that's sort of a grandiose statement, but I really believe it.
There are two fundamental technologies that have made this happen now versus 5-10 years ago. The first is computers, but personal computers, computers that you and I have. The second, of course, are the networks that connect the planet. And we've known them in terms of telephones, and everybody says, isn't it amazing, I can dial a number and get anybody in the world. True enough, but now my computer can dial every computer in the world, and we can, again, it's a network. So those two technologies have happened in the past couple of years with enough critical mass that we have what is commonly called the digital revolution.
Bob Stein, founder and manager of a leading publishing house for new media, is among the more critical observers of current developments.
We're going to be really putting into place an entirely new mechanism for humans to communicate with each other.
The principle underlying this new mechanism is the digitization of all human knowledge with the help of binary code, using only the figures 0 and 1.
For me, the digital revolution is described by understanding the difference between bits and atoms. Even if you didn't remember your physics, you know about atoms. You're made of atoms, you wear atoms, you eat atoms, you live in atoms. They have weight, they have size, they have color, they have mass. Bits, those little ones and zeros that make up what I'll call the DNA of information, they have no weight, they have no size, they travel at the speed of light. It's a totally different phenomenon. And once we understand the world in terms of bits versus the world in terms of atoms, it becomes a very, very different world.
A major American newspaper provides an example of this. Every day, tons of paper are moved and countless backs are bent to get the paper to its readers.
Winter I was over there, it was so cold. Brother signed up to go to Vietnam.
The publishing company owns more than 100 vehicles, each of which covers thousands of miles a year to cope with the distribution of all its issues. The same daily newspaper is available to millions of readers through the internet. One mouse click, and it appears on the screen, the information carried by weightless and bodiless bits over thousands of miles. The internet is a global cornucopia of knowledge that is unprecedented in the history of mankind. The World Wide Web provides access not only to topical information like newspaper articles, but also increasingly to ancient documents and even complete libraries.
I think that it's probably inevitable that the collected knowledge of the world that now is in libraries will end up being, if we can find the resources for it, scanned and digitized and made available on the net.
What we have now on the World Wide Web is an encyclopedia of all human knowledge. It's there, or it shortly will be.
The web is it. The web is the revolution. It's the battlefield where the digital revolution will occur.
I think the reason why the web is so exciting for many people comes out of the fact that it has the characteristics of a common carrier, like a telephone system, where we all have equal access to it. And it has the promise of a tremendously democratic culture arising out of it.
It is not clear whether the new technologies will live up to such optimistic expectations. While some people expect the dawning of a new age of peace, freedom, and a better life, others are worried about a potential loss of privacy and growing isolation in a colder, increasingly conformist world.
Strangely enough, the effect of the new technologies is not to bring us closer together, but rather to create a new kind of loneliness as the old forms of association and culture break down. The new technologies do not bring us into closer physical touch with each other, but electronic touch. So we are, in many ways, even more separated than ever before.
We're not heading for a lonelier world at all. It's the exact opposite.
These technologies that we're developing are extremely seductive and attractive to people. Whether or not what we're doing is good from a social perspective, I think we really don't know.
Where a simple pen and a piece of paper used to suffice, requirements have become much more complex, and there is growing concern that countless computer illiterates could be excluded from the brave new world of the digital future.
I see a couple of things that are real downsides in the digital revolution. There are a lot of people who don't have access to computers. It's very expensive right now to participate.
The divide is not rich, poor, north, south, east, west. The divide at the moment is generational. The young people understand it, the older people don't.
1, 2, 3.
Today's children use the computer far more naturally than their parents had used a telephone when they were young.
Was habe ich gesagt, Andi? Du kannst mal.
But the new media do more than simply convey familiar content in a new way. They also change the subject matter. The new visually powerful media connect words and writing, pictures and sounds, in an unprecedented way. Traditional teaching methods will certainly be influenced by these new developments.
The effect of the alphabet was to create a civilization of people who thought in words. And the effect of electric technologies is quite different. It emphasizes another area of the brain entirely, that is the one that thinks in imagery.
It can be very scary sometimes to realize how as a culture we are losing the ability to communicate with words.
Writing and literacy are no precondition for any electric medium. You don't have to have any indoctrination in literacy to use the telephone, for example, or to use the radio, or the television.
To assume that the digital world is the enemy of words is absurd. Words are very powerful. They always have been and they always will be. And understanding them, making them, being an orator, being a writer, being a thinker, being a reader are things that aren't going to go away. We know that words are in fact, per bit, the most powerful form of communication.
However, conventional ways of conveying words are in danger of appearing dated in comparison with the new media.
I tend to believe that humans are incredibly creative and they always find new uses for old media. So I don't think books are going to die.
The future of the book is the blurb. That is the very short statement, the aphoristic statement. Long books and long paragraphs and long sentences and long arguments have no place in the electronic world at all.
If you have something important you want to say to the society as a large, you write a book about it. And that's what's going to change.
What will happen in the future is that the pages of a book will be low-cost computer displays that can be rewritten. So I'm not going to abandon that interface. I'm just going to make it a writable and readable interface that the computer can basically create the book for you. So in the most absurd, in some sense limiting case, you can imagine a world where each person has only one book, but that book can become any book at any time.
At the moment, though, the book is stronger than ever. The number of titles published around the world is still growing from year to year, and libraries are bursting at the seams. The book has survived the advent of radio, film, and television. This suggests that even the digital age will not conquer man's love of the printed word.
There's more passion today in children for words, in spite of all the television and electronic games, because the internet and computers have brought them words, but words that are meaningful now, because it's words from friends, it's words that are in an area that interests them. So to suggest that the digital world is the enemy of words is ridiculous.
Nonetheless, the visual power of the new media remains undisputed, prompting some to see a link with those civilizations that have traditionally favored the right side of the brain.
Alphabetic writing is pretty much going to go the way that the long-playing record went, or the horse in the face of the motor car.
Whether or not we share that view, writing is undeniably undergoing enormous changes. When he has grown up, his word recognition program will probably do all the writing for him.
The actual act of writing, the actual making of the words, in my opinion, doesn't matter how you make them. If you want to write them, if you want to type them, if you want to speak them, or eventually just think them. You just think the words and they're going to come out. That's not important. What's important is the ability to express, the ability to condense, the ability to use the right metaphors and metaphors that are meaningful to readers. So storytelling, as one of the major kinds of writing, is an art that's not going to go away. It's an art that We will all be learning. Some of us will be better at it than others. But the act of writing is meaningless. It's just not a meaningful act.
Die Schrift wird auch im digitalen Zeitalter das Leid und das Lenken.
Even in the digital age, writing will still be the principal medium for mastering complex issues and presenting them in a simple and organized way. It will remain the single most important means of organizing human ideas and emotions. However, other worlds will also exist besides the world of writing, worlds we cannot even conceive of today.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
Whatever mankind may achieve in the future, language will always be the vehicle for our thoughts. Writing will remain the instrument we use to document our ideas, to keep them from sinking into oblivion.
A, B, C.